Those were the last words of a MedEvac pilot before the aircraft he was flying crashed in the ocean, killing everyone on board the plane. The investigation that followed uncovered several shocking details about this tragedy, and that's why I'm going to share with you what happened and the disturbing truth about this deadly flight. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. Our story begins on December 15, 2022, when a pilot and two crew members boarded a MedEvac plane at the airport in Maui. Their plan was to fly to the nearby island of Hawaii to pick up a patient that needed critical care. The weather was mostly clear skies, and this should have been a routine 20-minute flight, but unfortunately it turned out to be a deadly disaster. Before we look at how this tragedy happened, it's important to recognize the lives that were lost. Courtney Perry was only 40 years old, and she was a flight nurse on board the aircraft. She was also a single mom of 3, a sister, and a selfless friend that was described by her colleagues as an extraordinary woman with a vibrant spirit. Also on board the plane was 34-year-old Gabriel Camacho, who was the flight paramedic. Gabriel was inspired to become a flight paramedic after he required a MedEvac flight of his own several years prior. He was also a father of 3 boys, and his mother said that he died doing what he loved. Brian Treptow was 47 years old, and he was the pilot flying the plane, and he was also a victim of this tragedy, but we'll talk a lot more about him in a minute. First, it's important to understand that the aircraft they were all flying in was a 2000 King Air C90A. This is a twin turboprop aircraft, and it was equipped with 2 flight crew seats in the cockpit, but because the aircraft is capable of being flown by a single pilot, that's all the company required for this flight. Even though the aircraft wreckage sunk to a depth of over 6,000 feet between the islands, the NTSB was eventually able to recover everything they needed to determine that there was nothing mechanically wrong with the engines that would have contributed to the crash. That being said, the aircraft was equipped with a cockpit voice recorder, and it also had a unique feature known as a cockpit imaging system that included a video camera that recorded the instrument panel and everything else in the cockpit. Those 2 pieces of evidence allowed the investigators to see and hear pretty much everything that happened leading up to the crash. Unfortunately, what they discovered was just the beginning of several disturbing details, as the next part of the investigation led them to look at the pilot. Brian Treptow was the pilot flying the plane, and he had an airline transport pilot certificate with over 7,600 hours of total flight time. However, it's important to understand that most of Brian's experience was flying helicopters, and he only had about 950 hours in fixed-wing aircraft, with just over 600 hours in the King Air that he was flying when he crashed. That's still a lot of hours, but when the investigators started looking into Brian's history, that's when they started noticing some issues. Brian started off flying helicopters, and he earned his private pilot certificate for rotorcraft in February of 2008. He obtained his commercial license in November of that year, and then in May of 2009, he took a check ride to become a flight instructor. That's when he received his first notice of disapproval. That means he failed the check ride, but he ended up passing it on the second try a few days later. 4 months later, Brian went to get his instrument rating for rotorcraft, and he failed that check ride due to pre-flight preparation, flight by reference to instruments, navigation systems, instrument approach procedures, emergency procedures, and post-flight procedures. Now, I'm not sure if Brian had a really bad day or what, but in my opinion, if you fail a check ride for your pre-flight and post-flight procedures, then something is definitely wrong, and your instructor probably shouldn't have signed off saying that you were ready to take the check ride. Now, we don't have any further details on what happened, but Brian redid the check ride and passed just 5 days later. 1 month later, Brian was trying to get his flight instructor instrument rating, but he failed that check ride for navigation systems. Once again, he redid the ride and passed a week later. That's 3 check ride failures within a span of about 6 months, and to me it indicated that Brian was likely being pushed through training too fast, and he probably needed to pause and take some time to gain some more experience. Despite those initial failures, Brian continued to press on. Things seemed to settle down a little bit, and he eventually started flying fixed-wing aircraft, and over the next 9 years, he got his airline transport pilot certificate for helicopters, and he also earned his commercial and instrument ratings for single and multi-engine aircraft. However, things started to go off track again in August of 2018 when Brian went to get his airline transport pilot certificate for multi-engine aircraft. He failed that check ride for pre-flight procedures, takeoff and departure phase, in-flight maneuvers, and planning. He tried again 9 days later, but he got another notice of disapproval. This time it was for the takeoff and departure phase of flight, and eventually he passed on the 3rd try a few weeks later. At that point, Brian had type ratings to fly a Boeing 737, an Embraer 145, and a Learjet 60, but it's not clear if he was actively using these ratings, where he might have used them, and what company he was working for. All we know for certain is that in December of 2019, when Brian applied for a job as a MedEvac pilot at Hawaii Life Flight, he had accumulated disapproval notices for 6 different evaluations throughout his career, with 3 of those being within the last year and a half, and unfortunately his story isn't over. Before I share what happened next, I want to be clear about something. I'm not trying to attack Brian or say that he was a bad person. I'm sure Brian was a wonderful person to be around, and I know how difficult a tragedy like this can be for his friends and family. However, this is a debrief, and we have to put the emotions aside and look at the facts that might have played a role in this tragedy, and Brian's training and flight experience is a big part of that. Brian was hired by Hawaii Life Flight on December 2nd, 2019. As part of the initial hiring process, Brian completed 6 training sessions in an advanced aviation training device. During those 6 events, Brian received 5 unsatisfactory ratings, including 2 on the last training event. The company provided him with 2 additional sessions, and they marked his progress as satisfactory, and he finished the training on January 18th, 2020. Just 6 months after he was hired, in July of 2020, Brian had a check ride with the assistant chief pilot where he received an unsatisfactory for failure to follow the correct approach procedure and also landing from a circling approach. His mistakes were corrected in the air and he was graded satisfactory on the second try. 7 months later, in February of 2021, Brian had another check ride with the assistant chief pilot. This time he received an unsatisfactory for the evaluation because he failed to stop climbing at the assigned altitude during a missed approach, he didn't have the aircraft configured correctly for the approach, and he forgot to retract the landing gear on the second missed approach. After that event, Brian had to complete some training in one of the training devices, and then a few days later he passed the check ride on his second try. Another year went by, and in February of 2022, Brian received another unsatisfactory on a check ride. This time it was for his ILS procedures and holding, but it was corrected and signed off on the second attempt. 5 months later, on his next check ride, he had problems with his missed approach procedures and configuring the aircraft correctly, but again it was corrected in flight and signed off on the second attempt. Overall, Brian had at least 6 check rides with the company, and he failed at least half of those events on the first try. And if you're wondering how something like this can happen, this is where it's important to understand that Hawaii Life Flight was part of a larger organization called Guardian Flight that provided on-demand air medical transportation with a fleet of over 70 aircraft. Guardian's headquarters was in Utah, and the company director of operations, the director of training, and the chief pilot were all based there. Now, in my opinion, this led to a huge breakdown in communication and oversight, because despite Brian's struggles over almost a 3-year period with the company, no formal plan was ever developed to address those issues, and at no time did Brian ever go to the company headquarters in Utah to get any sort of retraining. In fact, after the accident, the director of training reviewed Brian's record, and he said that it included multiple unsatisfactory remarks and failed check rides that he was never made aware of. That being said, I haven't even told you the most shocking part of this story, but before we get to that, we need to talk about 2 more holes in the Swiss cheese model that contributed to this tragedy. The first hole in the Swiss cheese that we need to talk about is Brian's schedule. He worked 2-week rotations, and the first week he was on call during the day, and the second week he worked nights. The day before the tragedy, he switched from days to nights and started the night shift at 1700. The next morning, on the day of the accident, Brian was called to work, and he conducted 2 flights from about 0400 until 0630. Afterwards, he went home, and according to his next of kin, he was active all day and about to retire for the evening around 1930 when he was called to go fly what would become the accident flight. Now, technically, the company had a policy that allowed for Brian to call a timeout if he was fatigued, but he didn't say anything, even though by the time he started the engines, he had been awake for over 16 hours. The reason you need to know this is because the NTSB never mentioned fatigue in their final report, even though I think it was a big contributing factor to what happened. The other hole in the Swiss cheese was the weather. On the night of the flight, the weather was mostly clear skies with 10 miles of visibility, and the lowest reported clouds were at 7,500 feet at the destination airport. The only problem was that it was nighttime, and moonrise wasn't going to happen until midnight, which was about 3 hours after takeoff. That meant as soon as they pointed away from the island, most of the flight would be in the pitch black over the dark and featureless ocean. Even though these weather conditions were VFR, pilots have described this as IFR flying because it's so dark that it's like flying into a black hole, and sometimes you can't make out the horizon to know which way is up. And now that you know the dangers associated with the flight, we finally need to see what really caused them to crash, and then I'll share with you one more disturbing detail that the investigation uncovered. Brian started the engines and he called for taxi 5 minutes later. He took off from runway 2, and according to the flight data, as soon as he got airborne, he engaged the autopilot around 160 feet above the ground, and then he retracted the landing gear, passing through about 700 feet. The reason I want to bring this up is because according to the aircraft operating handbook, the autopilot should not be used below 500 feet during a climb. Even though it's dark outside, the sky was clear, and I don't think there was any reason for him to turn on the autopilot that early. I think this was probably just part of Brian's habit pattern, and perhaps it indicated that he relied too much on the autopilot to fly the aircraft for him. Moments later, as the aircraft climbed through 1,400 feet, Brian was seen passing money back to one of the crew members in the cabin, and shortly thereafter he started playing music on his cell phone as they continued the climb. First of all, this was a direct violation of the sterile cockpit rule. This is a rule that basically says if you're below 10,000 feet and you're not in a cruise portion of the flight, then you shouldn't be doing anything except the duties required to ensure the safe operation of the aircraft. Additionally, the company policy specifically prohibited the use of music players during any critical phase of flight. Keep in mind, this flight was only supposed to take about 20 minutes, so in my opinion, the entire flight is the critical phase of flight, especially when you're flying single pilot at night. You need to stay focused on flying the aircraft and getting ready to fly the next approach. As they climbed through 8,000 feet, Brian had another distraction. The multifunction display wasn't working, and Brian was seen repeatedly pressing different buttons on it to try and get it to work. The truth was that the display wasn't working on at least 4 previous flights, but it was never written up as being inoperative. Now that display isn't what caused him to crash, but it might have helped provide him some additional situational awareness during the flight. Eventually, Brian was told to climb and maintain 13,000 feet and to begin a turn to the south. As he completed the turn, about 15 seconds after he leveled off at 13,000 feet, that's when everything started to fall apart. The investigation discovered that the autopilot and the attitude indicator failed at the same time. The reason this happened is because the vertical gyro failed. This is a device that provides pitch and roll data to the autopilot and attitude indicator. When this happened, the only way that Brian can maintain level flight is by referencing the copilot's attitude indicator across the cockpit. He couldn't re-engage the autopilot, and that meant he was going to have to hand fly for the rest of the flight. This can be extremely disorienting when you're trying to do this at night in pitch black conditions, especially doing single pilot operations. As soon as it happened, Brian needed to maintain aircraft control and fly wings level, and then he should have declared an emergency and told the controller that he lost his primary attitude indicator and autopilot. The reason that's important is because it helps the controller understand that Brian might have trouble maintaining altitude or flying specific headings, and now the controller is going to pay a lot more attention to what Brian's doing. The autopilot and attitude indicator failed at time 21:06 and 58 seconds. For the next 90 seconds, Brian doesn't say anything. He doesn't declare an emergency, and he didn't tell the crew members that there was a problem. Instead, the aircraft began a very shallow climb and a small turn to the left and then back to the right, and then listen to what the controller said.
Takeoff Zulu fighting 180.
180, takeoff Zulu.
Takeoff Zulu, correction, flight heading 200.
200, Golf Zulu.
Instead of telling the controller that he was having trouble and declaring an emergency, Brian tried to comply with the instructions. 30 seconds later, Courtney asked him if the autopilot was out, and Brian said yes.
Takeoff Zulu, descendant pilot discretion, maintain 12,000.
12,000, Golf Zulu.
Takeoff Zulu, descend, maintain 8,000.
8,000, Golf Zulu.
Takeoff Zulu, traffic 12 o'clock, 3 miles northwestbound T44, 6,500 northwestbound VFR.
We'll be looking for 13, Golf Zulu.
The controller has no idea what's going on, and he's talking to Brian about other traffic, and it's now been 5 minutes since Brian started hand flying the aircraft, and he's still struggling to maintain control. Instead of him looking outside for that possible traffic, he needed to be focused on his instruments and flying the aircraft.
MedEvac 3 Golf Zulu, flighting 180.
180, 3 Golf Zulu.
MedEvac 3 Golf Zulu, could direct Tammy.
Direct Tammy, 3 Golf Zulu.
The controller just cleared him to Tammy, which is one of the initial approach fixes for the approach into Waimea. Unfortunately, Brian either doesn't know where that's at or he's not able to turn to the correct heading, and after almost 7 minutes of hand flying, the controller finally noticed that something was wrong.
3 Golf Zulu, verify going direct Tammy.
13 Golf Zulu is lost navigation here. We're gonna give it a try.
3 Golf Zulu, flighting 170. Continue right turn, heading 170. Maintain 8,000.
Hang on.
That would be the last radio call that Brian would make, and you can tell from the tone in his voice that he's not panicking. Everything seems to be normal, and that just goes to show you how disoriented he is. While he was making that radio call, he was in a descending right-hand turn, and the bank angle increased to 90 degrees. The airspeed rapidly increased until the indicator was pegged at 260 knots due to the limits of the gauge. A few seconds later, as they passed through 4,000 feet, there was a jolt and a loud bang, followed by the cabin becoming much quieter. That was most likely the point at which the tail of the aircraft broke off. The aircraft impacted the ocean just after that, killing everyone on board instantly. Before I share with you one of the most disturbing parts of this investigation, let me just say that this was a very difficult debrief because I don't think there was any excuse for what happened. Flying single pilot in a multi-engine aircraft on a dark night over the ocean is one of the most demanding environments you can operate in. Now, the autopilot can help you out, but if you're not prepared to take over the controls when something goes wrong, then the results can be deadly. That being said, I think the most disturbing part of this investigation was what happened during Brian's recurrent training in the advanced training device in February of 2022, which was about 10 months prior to the crash. He failed that event, and the instructor notes said, unfamiliar with company checklist, could not perform any cockpit pre-flight checks, poor knowledge of aircraft systems, unable to complete a non-precision approach, and emergency checklist knowledge weak. Again, I'm not saying this to slam Brian. I'm bringing this up because at this point, he had been flying the King Air for the company for 2 years. And in my opinion, if you can't perform pre-flight checks and you're not familiar with the company checklist after 2 years, then there's no reason you should be allowed to have pilot and command privileges to fly that aircraft. Brian reached a point where he didn't need more training. He needed someone to sit down with him and have that hard conversation to let him know that maybe he was a great helicopter pilot, but flying fixed-wing aircraft wasn't the best career path for him. The NTSB said the probable cause was Guardian Flight's inadequate pilot training and performance tracking, which failed to identify and correct Brian's consistent lack of skill, which resulted in his inability to fly the aircraft when the attitude indicator failed, leading to his spatial disorientation and subsequent loss of control. There's a whole lot more I could have talked about, but I hope I've shared enough that you were able to take away a few very important lessons from this debrief. If you learned something new, then be sure to check out another debrief on the channel, and thanks for your support.